a few announcements, and then we will finish. We will do part 2 of the discussion of Rorty's introduction to contingency, irony, and solidarity. But before we do that, like I said, a few announcements. We will finish the introduction today. So it's 4 pages. I hope you've read it. I'm now officially assigning the first chapter in contingency, irony, and solidarity, aptly named The Contingency of Language. And that starts on page 3. So please, I invite you to read it. We will begin the lecture on chapter 1 next Tuesday. In addition, as we were just discussing before we officially began, I will send you to the class email my lecture notes on chapter 1. Now, this time, I'm just going to send you one document. In the past, I've sent you an outline and the lecture notes. This time, I'm just going to send you my lecture notes, and you can use the lecture notes as a kind of extended outline. Okay, so be on the lookout tomorrow or Saturday for my lecture notes to Rorty's chapter 1 in contingency, irony, and solidarity. All right, and then one other just general observation or announcement. Start thinking about the final. The final is Thursday, literally 4 weeks from today, Thursday, May 14th. Okay, so after today, we've got 3 weeks of lectures. We've got 6 lectures, and then your final is the following week, Thursday, May 14th. I will send to you probably Monday the final exam question. So you have it. You have it in its formal prompt. You have all the instructions, and you have it. And you can have it along with you while we have the discussions about Rorty and as we move our way through the course. Okay, so be on the lookout around Monday for the actual final exam, and it's going to be standard procedure, 8 pages. This time it'll be 8 pages. Don't exceed 8 pages, and it will look like the midterm. And you're going to have the question 3 weeks ahead of time, 4 weeks ahead of time, so you can start working on it. Okay, are there any questions? Everybody feeling all right? Feeling good?
One quick question. Will you be sending it along with the chapter 1 notes, or are you going to wait till next week?
Yeah, I'll stagger them. I'll probably send chapter 1 notes tomorrow, and then the final exam question on Monday.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's kind of pick up where we left off on Tuesday, and let's finish our discussion of the introduction to Rorty's contingency, irony, and solidarity. Now, as a way of rehearsing where we were so we can prepare to get into the argument again from where we left off, let me just begin with sharing or reading Rorty's, I think, very poetic and creative and from a heuristic way, a very useful way of understanding or describing metaphysics, and as a way, therefore, of sort of creating a starting point, a launching off point for his critique of metaphysics. And in the introduction to Contingency, Irony, and Solidarity, Rorty writes, "The attempt to fuse the public and the private lies behind both Plato's attempt to answer the question, why is it in one's interest to be just, and the Christian's claim that perfect self-realization can be attained through service to others. Such metaphysical or theological attempts unite, try to bring together a striving for private fulfillment, private perfection, private meaning, try to bring a striving for perfection with a sense of community. Doing that requires us to acknowledge a common human nature. All metaphysical systems of thought require us to assume a common theological source or a common philosophical nature. And all metaphysical or theological projects ask us to believe or to celebrate that what is most important to each of us is what we have in common with others, that the springs of private fulfillment and human solidarity are the same. And that is Rorty's very poetic, heuristic, beautiful, kind of simple, but very powerful and in some ways comprehensive description of what all metaphysical systems are doing. And we spent last significant amount of time talking about that and unpacking it a little bit. And Rorty opens the book with this observation because, as we will see, the entire project of the book, in one way or another, not only insofar as the book serves as a kind of critique of philosophical metaphysics or some type of theological position, not just as a critique, but as a kind of way of articulating this idea that it is not possible to fuse the private desires for fulfillment, meaning, perfection, with a kind of public solidarity, a kind of conception of justice. There's no way to bring those two processes within a single comprehensive theory. There's no way of joining those two projects into a single comprehensive theory, whether it's a kind of Platonic metaphysics or some type of Christian theology. That project is not possible. And the argument that that project is not possible is not only for Rorty becomes a critique of metaphysics, but it also provides not the foundation, but the entry point, the starting point for his own argument. And what he's going to argue, and what becomes a critical argument throughout the book, as he writes, on the following page, on the first paragraph on the following page, he writes, "There is no way in which philosophy or any other theoretical discipline will ever let us combine the private and the public in a single comprehensive theory, whether it's a type of Platonic metaphysics or a type of Christian theology or other theologies. No theory, no philosophy, no religion will allow us to do this." And so this is Rorty's rather provocative claim, right? Metaphysics can't do what it wants to do, all right? And he says no theory will be able to do this. Now, I set it up like that so we can get back into the argument, right? For Rorty, as a postmodernist, as a person who subscribes to a nominalist account of what language is, right? For Rorty, language can't do that. No theory can do that because fundamentally, he's going to argue, metaphysics and theology misunderstand what language is. People who are committed to some type of philosophical metaphysics or who are committed to some type of theology, metaphysical theology, monotheistic theology, some sort of theology rooted in objective truth, assume that language is something that human beings can equip themselves with. And if we equip ourselves with the right language, the right mathematical formula, the correct definition, right? Or in a theological sense, if we read the correct text, we read the revealed words, that somehow that language, right, that we either discover in our search for the definition of justice in Plato's sense, or that language that is revealed to us in the sacred text, that somehow that language will kind of connect up with content in our minds, and that language and those ideas that are already in our mind will somehow either illuminate some deep truth in us, our objectively true self, or what nature has inscribed in our souls, as Plato would say, or reveal to us some objective truth out there. And Rorty's going to argue that way of seeing is just fundamentally, it's wrong, I suppose Rorty would say. It's not quite right. That's not what language is, right? And so Rorty says, look, metaphysics can't do what it wants to do. It can't combine, it can't fuse private meaning and fulfillment with justice, with a kind of public solidarity. It can't do it in a single comprehensive theory because no language will let you do that. And so that got us into the discussion last week of Rorty's notion of nominalism, right? And what his kind of vision of language. And for Rorty, as we said last week, we don't have to repeat the whole argument, but we can at least get into it again. For Rorty, language were literally words, and the meanings assigned to words and the way words and the meanings assigned to words get put into things called sentences, and the way the meanings and the words and the meanings assigned to words and the way they function in sentences and the way sentences function in larger languages and what Rorty will call vocabulary. That entire project is a human invention. It's aesthetic. It's a creation. It is artificial. It is it's an invented process. It's a construction. Language is construction. The words are arbitrary and the meaning is kind of arbitrary. It's a construction. And so Rorty says, look, first and foremost, language is a human invention. Language does not correspond to the objective truth. Language does not reveal the essences of things out there. Language does not somehow magically illuminate the truth inside us. There's no correspondence between words, ideas, and essences, right? And because language is a human invention. And not only is language a human invention, but it's also, as we saw in Nietzsche, a kind of power. As Nietzsche said, the lordly right to seize and to seize and define language, to create language, and to say this and this and this, and to open up reality, as Nietzsche had said in the first essay of the genealogy. That's a kind that inescapably, irreducibly, always has to be a kind of power, right? Because in giving words and giving names and giving meanings and giving value and giving purposes, you're asserting a sort of power, right? And you're opening up the space of what constitutes the meaningfulness of things, what Heidegger would call the worlding of the world, right? And that is always a kind of power. It's the kind of creative, assertive power, right? So language is a human invention, and it's an assertion of power. And ultimately, as we'll see, because it's a human invention, because it's an assertion of power, it's highly contingent. It's always contested, right? It's never stable, right? Because the things you're naming, the things you're describing, the things you are sort of giving meaning to, those things change. The world is indifferent to our meanings. New encounters with extant realities happen all the time. People fight and argue about what words mean. Historically, as people invent new words and meanings and ways of describing things, history changes. In fact, that's what Nietzsche called genealogy, right? And so language is not just only a human invention. It's not just assertion of power, but it's highly contingent. Hence the word contingency in the book. Contingency. It's subject to constant agon, constant conflict, constant debate, and it changes over time. So language for Rorty is this kind of human invention, and it's an assertion of power, and it is always changing. It's always contested. And for Rorty, this is a magical thing. This is an extraordinarily wonderful, potentially powerful, and potentially liberating thing. Now, to kind of move the argument forward about the necessity of separating the private and the public, what else is going on here? Why is nominalism not just important for how Rorty understands it, but how does it relate to his argument that no theory will ever allow us to combine a set of search for private meaning and private fulfillment with a kind of justice into one theory? What's going on there? And a really fascinating way of thinking about this is Rorty sort of takes this whole idea of language as an invention and thinks of it as tools, right? For Rorty, as we said last Tuesday, for Rorty, words are things that we invent. They, just like tools, we invent tools. We invent hammers, we invent saws, we invent screwdrivers and wood planes, and we build things. And Rorty wants to use that analogy to apply to the types of words that we invent. So for Rorty, in a kind of playful but incredibly interesting way, think of words as tools. Literally, words are words we invent. Words don't exist in nature. They don't spring from some noumenal rationality. They're not implanted in our souls by God. Words are things we invent. And they are literally things we invent, and they operate like tools. Words are tools, right? And we invent words that function as tools to do certain things. This is really an important part for Rorty, right? We invent words, we give the words meanings, and these word meanings, tools, help us do things, right? And what they help us do, or what they do for us, what's the functionality of word tools, what they do is that they describe our encounter with reality. They describe our encounter with a reality. They describe our encounter with things and processes that exist and that are the effect of causes that have nothing to do with human mind. And by the way, we'll see that argument in chapter 1. So words are inventions, like tools. We invent words, tools, to do certain things, and what those things do is describe things. Words are tools that describe, right? And Rorty wants to argue in the same way that we would invent tools that allow us to do certain things. We sort of invent a hammer to hammer nails, and a saw to saw wood, and a wood plane to find equal balance, whatever, right? Rorty makes the same analogy for language, right? Words and meanings are tools we invent to describe certain parts, different parts of our lives, right? And Rorty wants to say what we need to do is we need to think of language like this, right? And we need to think of our lives as having both a private part and a public part, right? We need to kind of conceive of our lives as broken up into constituent parts. There's a kind of a private part. There's a part of Nick Dungy's life that entails his private idiosyncrasies, his private wishes, his private fantasies, his private affairs. We need to conceive of ourselves as having a private life and having a public life, right? So at the same time that I have this private part of my existence in which I sort of cultivate the things that to me are meaningful, that have meaning, I sort of give certain things meaning, right? In the same way that we have our private lives, we also have, for Rorty, our public lives, right? And the key here with this whole discussion of words as tools, and tools that describe, and tools as descriptions that do different things, this becomes the key to the whole argument for Rorty right here. And in the same way, as we said on Tuesday, in the same way that it would never occur to us, right, to ask a saw to do the work of a hammer. In the same way that we would never ask a saw to do the work of a hammer, right? And not only in the same way that we would never ask a saw to do the work of a hammer, or a hammer to do the work of a screwdriver, it would also never occur to us to be critical of the idea that the saw can't do the work of the hammer, right? Nobody would have a meaningful conversation where they get into some profound dispute about the fact that the saw can't hammer the nail, right? In fact, it seems ridiculous to us, right? And so Rorty wants us to adopt that kind of perspective to language. So words are tools that we invent. We invent them to describe things and do certain things. And for Rorty, as this argument develops, he's going to want to try to convince us into thinking about words doing different things. So for Rorty, there are going to be sorts of word tools descriptions that are unique and specific to our private lives, right? He wants us to conceive of language, right, as tools doing different things. And so some words, Rorty will say, some word, tools, descriptions, the words, tools, and descriptions that we use in our private life are words, tools, / descriptions that are only for the private life, that are specific and peculiar to our private lives. And similarly, because you and I both simultaneously have a private life and a public life, Nick Dungy is a private person and a citizen, right? We have another set of word tools. We have another set of word tools, descriptions that we use in the public sphere, right? That we have a set of words, a set of meanings and definitions and concepts that we use together as people who share a shared social and political space, right? And so this is how this argument is setting up. For Rorty, words are human inventions. Meaning is a human invention. They are simultaneously a kind of assertion of power, and they function as tools. What do? We create them to do certain things. What do? They describe things. And the word, tools, metaphors, descriptions that we use in our private life are and should be private. And we'll talk about what he means by that in a second. And the words that we use to name and define and describe the shared and the political and the social life, those are a different set of words, right? And so for Rorty, we've got words as tools doing different things. I've got an entirely set of specific word tools that I use when I describe who I am, when I describe the music I like, when I describe the books I read, when I describe the people I love, when I describe, right, create or describe the things that constitute my private fantasies, my private fulfillment, my private search for meaning. And by the way, the better I get at this for Rorty, the better, right? In Rorty's kind of postmodern, hyper-aesthetic creativity, the more words, right, we have for this, the more unique, funky, stylized, idiosyncratic, poetic, slang, right? The more word tools we have to cultivate what Nietzsche would call this private garden, this secret garden, the better, right? That for Rorty, that's what Rorty's going to call the strong poet in chapter 2, right? People who are really good at this, who are really good at creating words, modifying words, stylizing words, bending words in an attempt to describe a private zone of life which is dense and interesting and creative and funky and kind of wild and sometimes kind of scary. That's amazing for Rorty. That's the project in some way. Now, the key to all of those terms, those word tool descriptions that I use to build this private life, to sort of decorate it, literally decorate it, right? Make it creative, make it beautiful, make it sensual, make it erotic, make it slang, right? Those words, right? Those, not only are those my words, right? But here's the key. Those words, because they are my private words, they're my tools in which I build this beautiful, dense, erotic, creative, sometimes even crazy idiosyncratic life. The words I use to build that private life are words that I require no justification to explain ever to a human being. And this is a really critical moment. The words, tools, descriptions we use in our private life are words and tools and descriptions that do not require justification to other human beings. So long, of course, and now Rorty's going to vibe Mill here, right? So long, of course, and now Rorty's bringing Mill in a little bit, so long as those words, tools, descriptions that I cultivate and create and mobilize and deploy in my private life, so long as those words don't harm other people or don't, as we will see later when he talks about the liberal islandists, so long as they don't harm other people or lend to cruelty. But we'll get to that in a second, right? So as Rorty will say, the vocabulary, he'll start calling this kind of system of these word, tools, descriptions. He's going to call it a kind of vocabulary, right? And each person does have and should have a private vocabulary. And that private vocabulary should be dense and funky and brilliant and crazy. It should be whatever you want. It should be the system of word, tools, descriptions, the vocabulary that describes and expresses and conveys, not just to yourself, but to other people, who the hell you are in the process and in the project of your private creation, of your aesthetic project. And those words, and this is the key, so I'll repeat it again. I'm sorry if I'm boring you. Those words, the words you use are your words, and they're words you never have to justify or explain to anybody, right? They are what Rorty will say, they're unshared, they're private, they're unsuited to argument. If I have these word tools about music or painting or about jazz or about sexuality or eroticism, right? And I'm telling this story about how obsessed I am with punk rock, or how obsessed I am with erotic literature, or how obsessed I am with opera, and the words that I use to describe those things, and why those things are meaningful to me, and why they celebrate a certain idiosyncratic vision of self-realization, right? Those words, as long as, Rorty argues, they don't harm or lead to cruelty, again, Mill's harm principle, right? As long as those descriptions that I'm using in my private life don't cause harm to anybody, those are my words. I'm under no moral justification. I'm under no command to explain or justify those words to anybody else, right? I'm under no moral obligation to try to justify to another human being why I think The Clash is the best rock band that ever existed, or why I think this opera says something profound, or why I've got this fetish for erotic literature, whatever. Right? And this is really important for Rorty. The word, tools, descriptions associated and that kind of illuminate the private sphere of our lives require no justification, right? As he says, the vocabulary system of word tools of self-creation is necessarily private, unshared. It's unsuited to argument. Now, Rorty will say, look, at the same time, right, because we live in modern, complex social democracies, social welfare democracies, liberal democracies, at the same time that you and I have these private lives in which we are defining and giving meaning to and expressing in all these creative, funky, idiosyncratic ways, we also are simultaneously, and this is true, this is common sense, we're also simultaneously citizens, right? Nick Dungy, who thinks The Clash is the greatest rock band ever, is also a citizen, you know, and living in Los Angeles, and I'm a citizen of Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is a kind of a social and political space I share with 10 million other people, right? And Rorty wants to say, as citizens, and this is kind of the beauty, it's a really kind of a fascinating reimagination of the private-public distinction, right? Rorty's going to say, look, as citizens, and everybody thorough, we're not leaving the city, right? And even if we were very antisocial like Nietzsche, we're still here, right? We are still citizens, and we still occupy a shared space with millions of other people. And Rorty wants to say, as citizens, as people who also have a public life, we use word, tools, descriptions to do that. We have words and tools and descriptions, mostly based on concepts about how we live together. So, Rorty, if you want to think about words, tools, descriptions that are in the public sphere, in the political sphere, you think about words like justice, or you think about words like equality, or you think about words like virtue, or you think about words like freedom, right? There's a whole set of word tools that are descriptions of ideas about how we live together, right? They are political words. They are public words. They are political words. They are words whose very function, whose purpose as a tool is in some way to attempt to describe, sometimes poorly, sometimes better, but to describe how these people live together in a certain time and space. And so, as the heirs of a kind of historically contingent moment in time and space, as Rorty's going to argue, right, our particularly historically contingent political space is kind of what we call what's left of modern liberal social welfare democracy. And there's a whole bunch of words associated with that, right? Freedom and equality and rights and respect and dignity and tolerance. In fact, there's even the very rich vocabulary of these word tools that we use to describe and define and animate and govern how the hell we live together, how we keep the public life together, right? And Rorty's gonna say, look, we always already have both lives going. We've got the private life, and we're doing our private, idiosyncratic, creative, funky, weird thing, which is ours, and we never have to explain it to anybody. And at the same time, we've got our public lives and our public language as tools to describe what equality is, what pluralism is, what freedom is, how do we conceive and move towards justice. And the key for Rorty for the public words and what makes the public word tools, descriptions, metaphors, what makes them different, categorically different from the private word tool metaphors, is precisely the idea. And by the way, this is what constitutes the publicness, the politicalness of the political and public space. It's precisely that those word tools descriptions are subject to justification and argument, right? The words that we use in the shared words that we use in the public space, the political space, that rich vocabulary, right? That sort of hovers around in this quantum sort of way, some abstract idea called liberal democracy. These terms of equality and respect and mutual dignity, mutual recognition, recognition of individuality, freedom, rights, right? Harm principle. These are word tools, concepts, which because they open a shared space or describe a shared political space, are words and terms that by their very sort of essence in this sense are debatable, right? They are public, and because they're public, they are open to debate. They're open to a kind of argument. When we have discussions in the public and the political space, in this sort of vision of Rorty, right? We are using word tools and descriptions that because they describe a shared space, a political space, an institutional space, a common space, precisely because that's their job as tools, as word tools to build that public space, that shared space, that political space, precisely because it's the job of those tools to open that shared and political space, that those words and those meanings and those descriptions are inevitably contestable, right? That we will and must expect and will always be engaged in a kind of contest about exactly what justice is, or how we want to manifest it, what exactly equality is, how do we improve it in the society, right? How do we recognize people as the bearers of some kind of right / protection against unjust or illegal encroachment by other people or government, right? These ideas are, because they open a shared space, are by definition subject to argument, subject to exchange. And so Rorty says the vocabulary of justice, by which he means these word tools that surround in this kind of quantum way the shared social and political space, the vocabulary of justice, the system of word tools that we use to open and discuss with each other and engage with each other in a shared social and political space. These words are public, and because they're public, they're shared, and because they're shared, they are susceptible to argument. If I'm going to make some argument, if I'm going to provide some description about what justice should be, or what equality should be, or what the limits of freedom should be, right? If I'm going to participate in the public sphere using those kind of word, tool, description metaphors, then I have to be prepared. This is part of the game. It's very Wittgensteinian in this way. I have to be prepared for my description of justice to be debated or to be contested or to be modified by other people. And for Rorty, two things must take place. One, I must be prepared for it. And two, that's a good thing, right? And again, here is, in this interesting way, Rorty sort of radicalizing Mill's sort of idea of the power and the utility of very dynamic, well-informed, edgy kind of democratic spaces, right? Recall when we were talking about Mill had this kind of idealistic vision of a kind of a liberal and progressive society that was characterized by the presence of these extraordinarily educated, thoughtful, free, active citizens engaged in a very kind of dynamic, sometimes unstable, highly contested democratic space where ideas were constantly being argued, and from the debate and argument of ideas come better ideas, and from that process for Mill, things move forward. Rorty's fascinated by that. He wants to take the metaphysical drift of it, the linearity, the sort of rational progressiveness out of it, of course, because he's postmodern in this regard, but Rorty's still fascinated by that. He still wants to celebrate a kind of postmodern, political, liberal, shared space where people have very interesting and potentially useful, in a pragmatic sense, useful tools, word tools and descriptions about justice and respect, and not to do cruelty, and to find ways to encourage equality, right? So Rorty has this vision, right, of one, this desire to separate the private from the public, to sort of think beyond or after the metaphysical attempt to bring the private and the public together in a unified theory, in a unified language, in a unified system of meaning, right? He wants to sort of, one, he says you can't do it, and you can't do it because language is an invention, and it's the words and the meanings are tools, and they're tools to describe certain things, and we have different tools to do certain things. The idiosyncratic, creative, wild, erotic, bizarre, slang word tools that I have in my private, and we all have them, by the way, right? All all that rich, dense, magical, funky vocabulary tools we have, which reflect the richness and the robustness of our private lives, right? Those word tools do a certain job. What do? They help us give meaning and value and purpose to our lives. And as long as the word tools descriptions that we're using to do that don't harm others, don't contribute to what he will say literally cause cruelty or to harm, then those word tools in my private life, those words never have to be defended by me. I never have to justify to any of you why I love Nabokov, why Nabokov is my favorite writer. I never have to explain that to you. I never have to explain to you why this erotic literature is fascinating, or making love like this is fascinating, or marrying these people is fascinating. I'm under no obligation to explain or defend or justify any of that to you. These are words that are tools that enable me to build rich, robust, beautiful, erotic, crazy private life. And the more you can do that, the better. And then I have a whole set of word tools descriptions that I have. And by the way, I've always had them, right? Because I'm born into this historically contingent society, right, called liberal democracy. And I've always been associated with, I've been raised in a society where we talk about rights, and where we talk about freedom, and where we talk about limited government, or where we talk about social justice, or we talk about equality. We talk about all these things. And the very essence of those words, because, and this is the key, it's kind of profound, it's really beautiful in a way, because those words open a political space. It's the space you and I belong in and thrive and recognize each other as other people in the space. Because those words open up that space in that way, those words are contested. You can expect them to be contested. In fact, that's a good thing, because the space is shared. If the words weren't contested, it wouldn't be a shared space. It would be domination, right? If the words of justice, or the words of equality, or the words of freedom, or the words of rights, or the words of dignity, if those words were not contested, if they weren't suitable to being challenged, and if I didn't have to justify why I think justice should be this, or why I think equality, if that didn't happen, it wouldn't be a social space. It would be tyranny. It would be domination, right? So the really important thing to know about Rorty, as he wants to argue, he's going to argue, look, no theory, no metaphysical philosophy, no theology, and no metaphysical philosophy or theology in how it understands language will ever be able to bring private fulfillment together with justice, with a kind of a political, a shared space. Can't be done, right? One, because linguistically we can't do it. They misunderstand language. Okay, so now we got to separate. We got to reimagine the public-private distinction. How do we reimagine the public-private distinction? Well, we begin that reimagination by adopting a nominalist notion of language. And we see language as an invention and as a tool that helps us describe things. And we have this toolkit. We've got a kit with tools that we use to describe our private life, right? And by the way, the more, and this makes sense too, because the more tools we have, the better, right? The more interesting and creative things we can build, right? The more nuanced and the more idiosyncratic and the more peculiar, the more funky, right? The more cool things, the more shit we can build as our life. Then we have these tools because we're always already citizens, right? I'm born and raised in what's left of late modern social liberal democracies. And the tools of this community are pluralism. There's multiple claims to good, and freedom is important. We should maximize it rather than reduce it. We should expand the conditions of equality. We should not harm people. We should try the best we can to distribute scarce resources. Those those words as tools that open and describe a shared space, those tools are necessarily suited to argument. They have to be defended, right? And so we have to think of our lives, and here's the key to Rorty. We have to think of our private life and our public life. Here we go. As equally important in a way. We have to think of our private life and our public life as equally important. I've got to build this secret garden that Nietzsche says. I got to be this strong poet, as Nietzsche says. I got to make my private life as interesting and creative and dense and beautiful and erotic and wild, right? And by the way, we're doing that anyways. That's what, in a weird way, that's what everybody's doing already. But at the same time, I occupy a shared space. And I occupy a shared space with millions of other people. And in that shared space are these word tools descriptions called justice and called equality and called freedom. And we've got to work that out, right? We have got to collectively, and maybe we arrange that through elections. Maybe you arrange that through political parties. There's all sorts of ways that you can imagine working that out. But we have to work that out. And those word tool descriptions that open and describe the social and the political and the shared space are themselves suitable to argument. You have to justify them. And Rorty says, so in this reimagining of the public-private relationship, it's quite interesting. He says we gotta okay, right? We gotta reimagine the public-private relationship. And he says, look, so we have to acknowledge that everybody has a private life and everybody has a public life. And while these lives are equally important, while the lives, these private and these public lives are equally important, they are nonetheless incommensurable. They are nonetheless, and the word he uses is incommensurable. You can't bring them together, right? And now look, to be sure, and some wild stuff is going to happen in chapter 3. Wait till we get to chapter 3. Some crazy stuff happens in chapter 3 because obviously, while Rorty wants to say the private and the public are separate, they're equally valid but incommensurable, which means that they can't be blended. They shouldn't be blended. They're like oil and water, kind of, in a way. They're incommensurable, right? You shouldn't ask the language tools of your private life to do public work, right? And you shouldn't ask the sort of public word tools to do the work in your private life. They're incommensurable. But to be sure, there's a kind of a boundary there, to be sure, and we'll talk about what that boundary looks like and how exchange takes place between the private and the public. Really interesting stuff in chapter 3. But for the most part, Rorty wants to say, look, we have a private life and we have a public life, and they're equally important, but they are incommensurable. And so we have to treat them separately, right? And this is a really important point. And Rorty says we need to think about the spheres of activity. We need to think about the activity and the word tools and the descriptions in our private life, the metaphors we use and the stories we tell, and the metaphors and the stories and the descriptions we use in our public life. We need to think of these as separate spheres of human activity. Equally important, both happening simultaneously, equally important, right? But separate. No theory and no theory of language, no religion is going to bring these two together. No theory of language and no religion is going to bring together in a single theory, in a single religion, the private, funky, crazy, idiosyncratic language of my private life together with justice. And in fact, as Nietzsche said, the attempt to do that creates the slave morality. As Mill says, we saw, and by the way, this was the tension of chapter 4. Remember when we were reading Mill, and I said, look, by the time we get to chapter 4, you're going to be pulling your hair out. right? Because chapters 1, 2, and 3 in Mill are these extraordinarily powerful, persuasive, interesting arguments for negative freedom, for human freedom, for the self to discover the true self, right? And then in chapter 4, there's that chapter 4 where Mill says, yeah, well, look, just so nobody thinks that this book on liberty is a book of selfish indifference to others, we still nonetheless, he says, remember, he says, we still nonetheless have a moral obligation. Remember, he said this. We still nonetheless have a moral obligation to help other people, to choose elevated lives rather than banal lives, intellectual pursuits rather than petty pursuits. Remember that? Right? And you got to chapters 4 and Mill, and you think, what the hell? Right? And the what the hell moment in Mill from chapters 1 to 3 to 4 was precisely that tension of trying in a comprehensive theory to bring private fulfillment together with a type of justice, with a kind of progressive, elevated, enlightened democracy. And it was, and as we said, we're not sure if it worked. And this is what Rorty's talking about. And so Rorty says, look, you got to conceive of life, you got to conceive of you and I as having two equally important, simultaneously happening all the time, zones of activity, modes, spheres of life, a private life and a public life. And the language that we use, the word tools that we use are specific. And what makes them specific is that the word tools, the descriptions that I use in my private life, I don't have to explain to any of you. You have no, I don't want to use the word right, but you have no authority. You have no justification, no authority, no right to demand that I explain to you why I think making love like this, or reading Nabokov, or reading Proust, or God forbid, Joyce, or why the music I listen to, or the piercings I have, or the clothes I wear, how I raise my children. As long as those word tools, descriptions that I use to build that world of Nick Dungy, that secret garden that Nietzsche was talking about in the preface, as long as they don't harm other human beings, as long as they don't add to a kind of stochastic terrorism, as if they don't contribute to cruelty, I'm under no obligation to explain anything to you. But when we meet together as citizens in a shared space, opened up, literally opened up by the words justice, the words freedom, the words institutions and laws and processes, then the words we use are suitable to argument. I have to justify them. And that is a kind of postmodern democratic process for Rorty. And so Rorty writes, and again, this is a very interesting move he makes. So not only should we see words doing different things, not only do we need to see words as tools and descriptions that do certain things, but we need to also think of authors as doing different things. And this is what he's talking about on the second page of the introduction. He says, not only do words as tools do different things, but when we're being intellectual and we're reading people, we're reading Proust, we're reading Nabokov, we're reading Wittgenstein, we're reading Marx, we're reading Hegel, right? We're reading the founding fathers, right? Rorty says you should think of different writers as doing different things too. Some writers, right? Rorty's going to argue, some writers are really good at helping us get better at cultivating these private word tools and descriptions. Some of them are really good. If you're interested in learning how to do that, or if you're interested in seeing what an example of that kind of life looks like, read Nabokov, he says. Read Nietzsche, he says. Right? Some writers are really good at producing or creating word tools, metaphors that accentuate, that open up, that make dense, make creative, make erotic, make beautiful a kind of private life. And some writers are really good at showing us that it can be done and helping us. And then other writers, he said, are particularly good at the sort of public words, right? If you want to read someone and think about justice in it, maybe even in a literary way, read Dickens. Dickens is very good at reminding us of the fact that we don't live up to our own values. If you're interested in equality and economic equality, maybe read Marx, maybe read some Adam Smith, right? There are writers who are particularly good at helping us with our word description tools in the public space. And so he says on the second page, he says, authors like Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Baudelaire, Proust, Heidegger, and Nabokov are useful as examples, as illustrations of private perfection, a kind of self-created autonomous human life, right? Those, they're really good. Nabokov is brilliant. Proust wrote 4,000 pages, the 3-volume set of things of remembrance of things past, right? Literally 4,000. It's 3 volumes. It compiles over 4,000 pages, right? Of him talking about wallpaper, literally, almost literally, right? It's a kind of inward, reflective, private meditation on the significance of wallpaper, or the carpet in his bedroom, or the fruit. And I'm joking a little bit, but I'm not. If you've ever read Proust, you know what the hell I'm talking about. And God forbid, if you read all 4,000 pages of it, you know what I'm talking about, right? And Rorty celebrating writers like this who are particularly good at showing us what a wildly creative, idiosyncratic, unique private life looks like. And then he says authors like Marx or Mill or Dewey or Habermas and Rawls, they are fellow citizens, right? And they are engaged in a shared social effort, the effort to make our institutions and practices more just and less cruel, right? So not only do we have different types of words to do different types of things that are both equally important and happening simultaneously, but incompatible, we should also look at different writers, right? We shouldn't look to Nabokov to tell us about justice, right? And we shouldn't read Habermas to help fulfill and bring a little light to the dark closets in our life of idiosyncrasies. And so he says, we shall only think of these two kinds of writers as opposed if we think that a more comprehensive philosophical outlook would let us hold self-creation and justice, private perfection, and human solidarity in a single vision. But there is no single vision to do that. There's no single theology or metaphysical philosophy, and therefore account of language that will allow us to do it. So we need to see words doing and functioning, operating as tools to do certain things. And they do it in a private life and they do it in a public life. And so he says, and I'll repeat where I began. Then he says, there is, he says, right in the middle of the second page, page 14, in the introduction, there is no way, he writes, in which philosophy or any other theoretical discipline will ever let us do that, fuse the private and the public. The closest, and now he's gesturing to a postmodern liberal democracy. Now he's radicalizing Mill, and he's making Nietzsche compatible with democracy. Can we make Mill's negative freedom and harm principle postmodern? And can we make Nietzsche, strong poet, a good Democrat? Right? Can we do that? What's it look like? The closest we will come to doing that, he argues, the closest we will come to joining these two quests, private fulfillment and the fact that we have a shared space called politics, search for justice. The closest we will come to joining these two quests is to see the aim of a just and free society as letting its citizens be as private and irrational and aesthetic as they please, so long as they do it in their own world and using no resources needed by the less advantaged. The vocabulary of self-creation is necessarily private, unshared, unsuited to argument. The vocabulary of justice is necessarily public and shared, a medium for argumentative debate. And so in that discussion, we see the beginnings of Rorty's project. Can we take Mill's very beautiful obsession with individual freedom, negative freedom, with, as he said, Mill had said, people need to be free from social oppression. People need to be free from social influence, from social tyranny. Remember, right? He said when the tyrant is social conformity and it reaches all the way down to the soul and it enslaves you, right? And Mill said people need to be free from that. They need to be free from other people and the public and the fucking government telling them who they are and how they ought to live. Mill said that. They have to be free from that so they can be free and create, well, he thought of it in the language of discover, but so they can find that self, right? And here, Rorty is kind of radicalizing that. He's making that a postmodern project, right? And that's what he's talking about. The closest we can come to joining these two quests is to see the aim of a just and free society. What does a postmodern liberal democracy look like? What does a just and free postmodern liberal democracy look like? Well, on the first part, it says, look, let's take Mill's obsession with freedom and negative freedom and the harm principle, make it postmodern. Let's finally own up to it. Let's finally own up to the contingency of liberal democracy and perfect it. And we do that by letting citizens, by letting other human beings be as private, irrational, creative, funky, idiosyncratic, bizarre, and aesthetic and creative as they please, so long as they do it on their time and they don't harm people. And when we function as citizens and we talk about our desire to uphold the values we already have, even if they're contingent, even if they're historically constructed. We talk about the values and the need to uphold and manifest the values we are already committed to, like freedom, like equality, like respect, like rights, like the distribution of scarce resources, right? We do that in a kind of intense, argumentative exchange. And that's the best we do. And the upshot of that exchange is what is true and constitutes the kind of relative definitional meaning tool in the community at that time. So after sort of articulating that argument, Rorty closes the introduction with an introduction to what he wants to call liberal irony, the liberal ironists, right? And as he says on the top of page 15 of the introduction, he said, this book tries to show us, it tries to convince us, it tries to show us how things would look. What does this postmodern liberal democracy look like? This book tries to show how things look if we drop the demand for a theory which unifies the public and the private, and are content to treat the demands of self-creation and of human solidarity as equally valid, yet forever incommensurable. It sketches, now, so what does it look like to be a person in that society? Now we slide in to his discussion and his description of the liberal ironist, the postmodern liberal Democrat. He says, it sketches, still on page 15, it sketches a figure whom I call a liberal ironist, right? And again, he's being poetic. And as we said when we first met Rorty, he's not using irony in the Platonic sense. He is not using irony in the Platonic sense, which means to write or say something with the intention of something else. He's defining, of course, he's defining irony in his own way, right? And he says, so what does it look like to be a person who lives in a postmodern liberal democracy? And Rorty says, well, my description, here's my poetic creation. Let's try to imagine ourselves as liberal ironists, okay? And he says, well, what the hell is that? What does it look like to be a liberal ironist, right? And he says, it sketches a figure whom I call the liberal ironist. And he says, and I borrow my definition of liberal from Judith Sklar, who says that liberals are people who think that cruelty is the worst thing we do, right? And that's just his way of kind of summarizing liberal philosophy, right? The best value, I think, for Rorty of liberal philosophy would be its still to be realized value of treating people well, of treating people equally, of treating people with dignity, of trying to reduce cruelty to other human beings, right? And so Rorty says, for me, my definition of what it means to be a liberal, right? My definition, or when I think of what it means to be a liberal, this is what comes to my mind. And he says, for me, liberals are people who think that cruelty or harm is the worst thing that we can do. And by the way, this is Rorty's poetic treatment of Mill's harm principle, right? Mill had said, look, people ought to be as radically and as comprehensively free to think, speak, and act. People ought to be as radically and comprehensively free to think, speak, and act, Mill argued, so long as it doesn't harm another human being. So again, Rorty is vibing Mill. He's vibing Mill's harm principle. He's bringing Mill, one of the great liberals, one of the great advocates of freedom, one of the great liberals, and he's bending them. He's stylizing them. He's appropriating those ideas in a postmodern way. He says, I agree with Mill. Harm is the worst thing we can do, and we shouldn't do it. We shouldn't allow acts, thoughts, and words and acts, even if we want to think they're free, to harm other people. That's a value. And Rorty says, I celebrate that. Now, he says, and in the next passage, I can't give you a metaphysical reason why we shouldn't do that, because there is no reason. I can't give you an algorithm, he says. I can't give you an utilitarian calculation. I can't give you, I can't adjudicate in a perfectly rational and clear way how that is done, because it's not possible. No language can do that. No algorithm can do that. No utilitarian calculation can do that. This idea that for liberals, the worst thing we do is harm is a historically contingent idea. And at least in this time and space, it has a kind of pragmatic value. We ought to celebrate it more. So the liberal of the liberal ironist for Rorty is somebody who as good liberals even now, Rorty is going to argue, in our postmodern liberal democracy, we ought to be sort of identifying ourselves as people who want to reduce harm. And then the ironist part, and then we'll be ready to move to chapter 1. The ironist part is the postmodern part. The ironist is someone who bears witness to and acknowledges and accepts the contingency of his or her greatest or deepest values. Ironists are individuals who acknowledge the nominalist and contingent claim that cultural and political values are human inventions, but they are still willing to fight for them. So the goal as we end the first chapter and end the introduction, the goal is to create as free and open liberal democracy based on the recognition and acceptance of contingent cultural values and space that allows individuals to be as creative and poetic and funky in the creation and expression of their lives as they can, so long as they do no harm. All right, beautiful people. Bam. That's it. Love you guys. Read chapter 1, and we will continue down the rabbit hole with Rorty.
Thank you.
All right, Professor, thank you.